Hello, everyone, and welcome to our review of European exploration and the Columbian exchange. I hope you're all having a very good week, and I hope you're all kind of starting to fall into the pattern of the class, realizing kind of what we're going to be doing on a weekly basis, becoming more comfortable with that, knowing what kind of answers I'm looking for, how I'm grading assignments, as well as becoming more comfortable with communicating and responding to uh, your fellow students. So I hope that's all falling into place nicely. And of course, if you have any questions as we go along, make sure to contact me and let me know because I am always here to help you succeed. PowerPoint question number 1. To what degree did the Portuguese owe other civilizations for their seafaring developments? And I think it's a good idea here to go back to where we left off last week, talking about how Europe for a long period of time had been a rather isolated location on the world scene, and how really it was only through some small connections between those Italian city-states and Arab seafarers and traders, as well as the fall of Constantinople and the effect that that had, that some of this technology, information, and kind of contact, as well as some trade goods and others, which kind of showed Europeans what they were missing out on, all kind of coincided with one another and made it and allowed for Europeans to kind of break through that isolation for the first time and sort of re-enter the world community in a large way. Not saying there were no contacts prior to this, as we know there absolutely were, but not to the degree, of course, that was going to develop through the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Of course, a lot of you did an excellent job pointing out the role that technology played in this. The introduction of technologies such as the astrolabe, the lateen sail, the compass, as well as the kind of knowledge that Arab seafarers had and were able to pass on to European seafarers, was all very vitally important in allowing the Portuguese and future European explorers and traders uh, to break out and start re-entering and reintegrating with the world. And I think this idea of kind of the expertise behind the traders and the seafarers of other cultures is very important in this process. And an example, a very good example of this is the first voyage of Vasco da Gama, where he was able to sail down the coast of Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope. But to get to India, he didn't just sail directly there in order to find his way into those trade networks. They actually stopped in East Africa, and he was able to pick up an interpreter and a guide who was involved in the East Indian trade or in the Indian Ocean trade networks from East Africa, which was very vibrant in those trading cultures, to actually sail and show him and the rest of his ships the way into Calcutta and into India, and that they owe a lot of their success to the knowledge and the expertise of kind of these guides that they picked up along the way. Of course, that shipment came back. Da Gama was successful in his ventures and really showed the profitability which was feasible in these overseas ventures. Uh, Also, I would say kind of the re-entry of Europe into the world was also very important at this point in time, because you really see Europe re-entering the world and bringing in kind of the same prejudices and ideas of cultural superiority, which for a long period of time had kept them isolated. That doesn't really change. That sticks with these European traders and seafarers and kingdoms and empires that they are coming from, and really only begins to expand as they begin contacting, interacting with the other cultures, civilizations, and peoples around the world. Moving on to question number 2, in what ways did the Portuguese set the stage for future European explorations and conquest? And I really break this down into three main aspects. The first is profit. The very fact that the Portuguese, through trading in the New World, setting up plantations in those islands off the coast of Africa and harvesting sugar and sugarcane, as well as setting up colonies, such as, for example, in Brazil, really showed the profitability that could come with this. Portugal enriched itself from going from a relatively new, small, and unwealthy country into one of the most wealthiest countries in Europe in a relatively short amount of time because of their success in this overseas exploration and trade. And it's not a surprise that other countries such as Spain, France, and Great Britain were going to be following suit very shortly after this. So profit was one of the main driving margins, with the uh, price of spices dropping across Europe because of the increased supply, the amount of wealth that these countries are able to accumulate for themselves, all leads to kind of the competition that was involved with these various European countries with one another. And if one country was going to do something that was going to enrich them and empower them, you should be able to bet that the other European countries are going to be following suit fairly shortly afterwards. Another key way that Portuguese really set the stage for future European explorers was expertise and experience. The fact that the Portuguese, because they were a relatively small country, did not have a huge kind of naval trading fleet or experience, so a lot of times they would hire mariners from other places around the Mediterranean or the coast of Europe who did have experience from countries such as Italy or France or England, and were able to, in a sense, kind of train and get those individuals experience in this kind of long distance trade that they were able to take back to their own countries, or for that matter, Portuguese volunteering their skills for other expeditions hosted by these other countries that they could then go out and venture on those ships and on those missions as well. And I'd say the third way that the Portuguese really set the stage for future European exploration is violence. A lot of times, as I think the textbook mentioned pretty clearly, the Portuguese did not come in peace. Vasco da Gama, on his first mission, ultimately ends up getting in a fight and a conflict, and burns a number of traders alive from other ships in the Indian ports, as well as the conquest that they're making on some of the islands off the coast of Africa, and the negotiations that they're forming into with those locations along the coast of Africa, all kind of leads into that. The precedent of using enslaved individuals on their islands to grow the sugar, of course, is another precedent that is then quickly emulated by the Spanish in the Caribbean. And all of this, I think, fuels into the patterns that you see European explorations eventually kind of falling under. All right, PowerPoint question number 3. In light of such facts, how should we view Christopher Columbus today? It seems like, for the most part, all of you realize that there is certainly a difference between the myth of Christopher Columbus, which a lot of people were taught in elementary school or grade school or even up to high school for some people, and the reality. The fact that Christopher Columbus was not the first European to discover or enter into contact with the Americas, the fact that he did not wasn't the first person to believe the Earth was round, that had been a long-established fact, the fact that he more than likely had maps or other indicators recognizing that there was land on the other side, that wasn't a completely new or novel idea, and really the fact that more than anything, he was a determined individual. Some people could certainly, I would say, classify him as a brave and an ambitious individual. But in order to be successful, he had really a lot of luck at the same point in time that kind of put him in the right place at the right time. So I think a lot of you recognize that there was this huge difference between kind of the myth of Columbus and the reality of Columbus. Also entering into that, the idea that Columbus, when he did reach the New World and come into contact with a different culture, certainly was not the what we would consider today the on his best behavior, right? Engaging in a lot of activities that we would consider very appalling by today's standards. Kidnapping the Arawak Indians, the way he conducted himself and allowed his men to conduct themselves as the governor of those provinces, to the degree where it pretty much led to the extinction of the American Indian populations, and a lot of people calling into question the place that Columbus should play in our view of him today because of all of these, what we consider now, very negative aspects. A lot of, or some people at least, called that kind of viewpoint into question, kind of making a cultural relevancy kind of argument, saying that, given the fact that we can look back and judge Columbus in this way, that other people from the culture he came from would not have viewed him in such a negative light, and that we're kind of using our modern standards to pass judgment on Christopher Columbus because it was just in his culture to be acting the way he was. Um, I have heard that argument several times, and the biggest pushback I would see or make against that is that um, arguing that Christopher Columbus was simply a product of his culture, and that we should not be looking at him or judging him by modern standards, really only takes into the viewpoint European culture, or the Spanish or Italian culture he came from, and completely ignores the Arawak side. As much as it may have been in Columbus's culture to view himself as superior, to try to find gold at the expense of enslaved individuals, to try to press his religion on them. As much as those aspects might have been part of his culture, it certainly wasn't part of the Arawak Indians' culture to be enslaved, raped, and killed. So that by saying that you can only view Columbus by his own cultural standards completely takes out the viewpoint of the Arawak Indians, because what standard are they to be judged by? In some cases, I would make the argument that the only way you can really view kind of the moral relevancy of one individual or one place is when they do come into contact with someone who is from a different culture, and how they act and interrelate with people from that different culture. Because looking back and simply trying to place Columbus and view him only from a European perspective is essentially just saying European perspective is right or correct that they had at that point in time, which I think most of us today would say is probably not what we would be arguing for. I also think this gets to the point, and a lot of people mention this as far as Columbus Day, um, and I think a lot of people were certainly willing to say that Columbus is not a morally correct or a commendable individual, but they still wanted to say that he is deserving of respect or that he is deserving of his place in history. And I see the value of that because he certainly was important. He is essentially the first example or the first bearer of sustained contact between the Eastern and the Western Hemisphere. That being said, it's hard to believe that at this point in time of exploration, if Columbus had not discovered the Americas, that someone else certainly would have. But I think it's important, and this is the first time I'll mention this, and I'll be mentioning it as we go on as well, that there is a real difference between remembering history and glorifying it. And Columbus, I think, is a key example of this, that Columbus's place should certainly be remembered, and it should certainly be taught, but it should be taught in the right context. Uh, and I think there's a big difference between that and glorifying him as an outstanding individual who deserves to have his own holiday, or deserves to have elementary schools named after him, or all the other ways his place in society is not just remembered, but really celebrated and glorified. And I think that's really where the question needs to come in. To what degree do you want to remember a historical figure versus, saying that, commemorating them or glorifying them or their activities? Because there's plenty of other of historical figures that we can come across and talk who have had monumental importance, who we do not glorify, right? We mark their importance and the part that they played, but we certainly don't say that they're people worthy of having holidays named after them, or commemorating them in other ways. So just something to keep in mind as we go along here, that Columbus, like many of the people we're going to be talking about, certainly was a complex figure, and that's one of the great things about history, being able to think about these kind of tough questions and see where we come down on them. Alright, PowerPoint question number 4. Can you think of some foods we eat today that are only made possible by the Columbian Exchange? Now, it's important to note, first of all, and I felt that there was a little bit of confusion here. When we're talking about the Columbian Exchange, we are not only talking about the goods and the contact that was made between Columbus and the New World. This was a long, drawn-out, sustained process of mixing of foods, people, animals, and diseases from the eastern to the western hemispheres after coming in sustained contact for hundreds of years after this time period. That entire 100-year process is called the Columbian Exchange, of which Columbus actually had an incredibly small role to play, outside of just being the first kind of leader of the group that made kind of sustained contact. But that being said, this process is far more important, I would argue, than the individual, because so many of the foods that we eat today are directly impacted by this. And I thought the class did a wonderful job kind of identifying a lot of these foods, thinking things like hamburgers, hot dogs, hot chocolate, spaghetti, pizza, Spanish rice. All of this has is only made possible by the Columbian Exchange. But more important than just all the great tasty food that we get and how people around the world have found very interesting ways to combine the Columbian Exchange foods into their own cultural or ethnic dishes, um, I think it's important to note even more so that the modern population levels that we see within society today are really only made possible by the Columbian Exchange. That the majority of the food that we grow and eat in our own country is based upon wheat, for example, which is of course an old world crop, which is now being entirely grown and raised in the New World. The potato is an excellent example of how this was playing out historically. The population levels of locations in Northern Europe, for example Ireland, could be greatly enhanced after this time period by the introduction of the potato, a New World crop, into the New World. So tons of various cultural mixing is going at this point in time. Just one more example I think that really is cool that typifies this is the story of the turkey. The turkey was a New World bird that was captured and brought back to Europe at this point in time and was eventually traded to people within the Ottoman Empire. And it was in the Ottoman Empire, which were pretty much controlled and ruled by an ethnic group known as the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, and that's where the turkey gets its name, that the turkey was ultimately bred into the kind of much larger, meatier animal that is similar to what we have today. And in fact, some of the first kind of colonists from Great Britain coming back to the New World were actually carrying this kind of new hybrid turkey with them that was then reintroduced into the Americas and ultimately became kind of the most popular common food bird that we know of today that is being populated. So a very kind of interesting historical story at this point in time of this exchange and process that's going on and how international it actually is. Of course, there was a dark side that came along with the exchange, and just as important as it was for the food and the contact that we see and the population levels that we have today, a lot of it was built off of a lot of catastrophe and destruction of those civilizations, societies, cultural groups, and peoples in the New World. A lot of you did a very good job identifying the vast and drastic impact that these Columbian exchange diseases, which killed up to 90% of the population, had. But I don't think you can undersell or underestimate the importance of this in world history. These Columbian exchange diseases are quite possibly one of the most important determining factors in how our world looks today. And without this process occurring, without these diseases being spread, and without such a large population loss within the Americas, it's entirely possible our world would look completely different today, because so much of what came after this, the success that European nations had in colonizing the New World, the eventual creation of the British colonies, the eventual United States as it came to be formed after the Revolutionary time period, all of that is really predicated on what happens at this time period. And far more important than anything that one individual, for example, Christopher Columbus ever did, was really, this time period where these diseases get exchanged from that relatively small population of Spanish or Europeans coming in contact with American Indian populations during this time period, and how these diseases spread and rippled out from there. So as to the question, what impact was this going to have? First of all, if you think about 90% of the population, a lot of you did an excellent job of pointing those out in your answers, that you're really talking about the complete collapse of your civilization. The economy is going to be completely decimated. The vast majority of what people are doing to either obtain food or anything else that's built upon that is going to be completely dissolved. A incredibly amount of stress on any kind of cultural knowledge is going to be hard to pass on. lifeways, all of that. I mean, if you want to kind of make a comparison of what we might think today, think about like those kind of post-apocalyptic movies or TV shows like The Walking Dead, and how civilization has developed or has become after that. Of course, minus the zombies. But you get the idea of how kind of decimated the landscape is, the impact it has on people, on their society, on their culture, and how really the world looks like a very pale comparison to what we think of today. The same thing happens with the Americas here and the incredibly rich, widespread, and vibrant cultures which had once occupied the Americas in kind of an astonishingly short amount of time are drastically impacted and drastically affected by this. And by the time a lot of the Europeans come into contact with American Indian groups, they're coming into groups that have just recently survived this process. So they're much smaller. A lot of them are reorganized from, few scattered survivors from much larger previous groups. And a lot of cases are just trying to recover from this entire process. It's important to note that the 90% number I put up there is not 100% due to the diseases themselves, but also the ripple effect that these diseases would have. The fact that the food production within your community would decline, the law and order in a lot of cases would break down, the violence that could occur from that. That it's kind of a ripple effect that is coming into play here as well. But all of those really lead into the overall devastation which was occurring here. And it's very poignant that some of the very earliest accounts from Europeans, for example, the English settlers that came to the New World, was essentially finding a very barren and open landscape. In some cases, they even found village sites that American Indian groups had been populating, even just 5 to 10 years prior, that Europeans were able to pretty much move into. They could dig up corn that American Indians had left for the previous winter or winters to come and use it themselves, and essentially having an entire area that had recently been depopulated set up for them to move in. Of course, without any real knowledge of these diseases, the earliest colonists from Europe oftentimes thought of this as some sort of divine providence, that God had essentially granted them this land and had done all this work for them, when of course no, it was American Indian groups that had recently been pretty much decimated by this process of disease and societal collapse, which was affecting all portions of the Americas and was going to continue to affect all these portions of the Americas for a prolonged period of time to come. So really cannot underestimate the importance that this ends up having on world history, and it's hard to contemplate how different the world would look today had this process been different. Okay, from there we're going to go ahead and switch over to looking at our document exercise for this week. As our first document exercise, I want to say that everyone did overall a very good job of answering the questions. I was really impressed. You did some really good job of picking out specific examples from the documents, which I loved. Just remember that you also have to be commenting on other students' posts. The vast majority of people who lost points this week was because they were not commenting on the post of another student. And remember, you're going to get 10 points for writing your response or your answers to my questions. Then you're going to get an additional 5 points for commenting on another student's response. So make sure you're doing both parts of that. But just to point out some of the highlights that you came up with and made from the document. Going through question number 1, how does Bartolomeo de las Casas depict American Indians? And what evidence does he present to argue his case about whether or not they should be considered civilized? And he really establishes this right off the bat, that there are important kingdoms, large numbers of people who live settled lives in a society, great cities, kings, judges, and laws, persons who engage in commerce, buying, selling, lending, and other contracts of the law of nations. Essentially, what De las Casas is doing here is kind of making a checklist of what anyone in Spain would consider civilization, and saying, look, these American Indians have all of this. Everything that we think of ourselves as being civilized, the American Indians have the exact same thing. So it really doesn't make sense to consider them uncivilized. And he reinforces that later on here, where he says, they are not ignorant, inhuman, or bestial. Rather, long before they heard the word Spaniard, They had properly organized states, wisely ordered by excellent laws, religion, and custom. He even at one point goes on to say that the societies that the American Indians set up were comparable and in some cases almost better to what the Spanish had. So really giving the American Indians a lot of credit and really clearly arguing why he thinks that they should be, for the most part, considered civilized. Of course, he has his own kind of qualifications to this, which we'll be talking about in a moment, but those are the primary arguments that he's using. So question number 2, in what ways does Bartolomeo de las Casas use European and Spanish history to make his argument? And a lot of people did a really good job of pointing out how he is using Spain's past of being essentially a colonial part of a colony of the Roman Empire and the impact that that had. As you can see here, he says, now see how he called the Spanish people barbaric and wild, talking about an author writing at the time of Caesar Augustus. So essentially calling the Spanish the same thing that the Spanish are now accusing the American Indians of. And he goes on to say, does he think that war of the Romans against the Spanish was justified in order to free them from barbarism? Saying, was it correct for the Romans to do what they did to us? And then goes on to say, next I call the Spaniards who plunder the unhappy people torturers. Do you think that the Romans, once they had subjugated the wild and barbaric peoples of Spain, could with secure right divide all of them among themselves, handing over so many head of both males and females as allotments to individuals? So pretty much saying if the shoe was on the other foot, how would the Spanish feel? If the Romans had really treated the Spanish the way the Spanish are currently treating the American Indians, how would Spain look today? What would those people have been like? And would Spain today like to be treated in that way? Of course, the answer, somewhat rhetorical to all this, is of course no, that the Romans treated the Spanish much better than the Spanish were currently treating the American Indians. They did not sell them all into slavery and divide up their land to wealthy Romans. And through this, Bartolomeo de las Casas is arguing that this is not then how the Spanish should be treating the American Indians. Question number 3. In what ways does Bartolomeo de las Casas' European bias show in this article, and what parts of his argument might have American Indians refuted? And of course, this is really when this idea of bias within primary sources comes into focus, because everyone's writing from their own perspective, their own viewpoint, their own kind of cultural baggage is going to come along with it. And of course, being a bishop in the Catholic Church, that is very apparent throughout this document here, and really where that European bias starts coming into play. A very good example is from the fact that Indians are barbarians, it does not necessarily follow that they are incapable of government and have to be ruled by others, except to be taught about the Catholic faith and to be admitted to the Holy Sacrament. So here, he's essentially saying that while he's still considering them civilized, he's still making a separation between them and the Spanish. He's not necessarily calling them barbarians here, but he's essentially saying even if you want to grant that fact, even if you want to grant what Sepulveda is saying, that you can't say that they're incapable of government because he just argues that they are. But he is putting that qualification in there, right? That government by their their own rules that are completely kind of comparable to ours, except that they should be taught the Catholic faith. So he's pretty much willing to grant them all aspects of civilization, except for religion. And then he wants them to completely abandon their own religion and go with, his own Catholic religion. This is reinforced up here where he says the Indian race is not that barbaric, nor are they dull-witted or stupid, but they are easy to teach and very talented in learning all the liberal arts, and very ready to accept, honor, and observe the Christian religion and correct their sins. Certainly, the American Indian groups he was in contact here would not have believed that they were sinning in any way, shape, or form by simply worshiping the gods that they had worshipped for hundreds of years. It's also interesting to note that De las Casas does not take into account the fact that these American Indian groups created these civilizations that he's arguing for, through worshiping their traditional religions, and were being served perfectly fine by it, which I'm sure a lot of the American Indian groups would have been more than willing to point out to him. But he is using that essentially as a way to argue that Spain does still have this kind of cultural superiority in a certain way that should be influenced and imposed upon the American Indians, even if they should be considered civilized and they should not be currently kind of being victimized by the wider encomienda system, the dividing up of indigenous individuals, essentially being made into slaves and granted to these kind of Spanish conquistadors. That's really the system that he's fighting back against. Which moves on to question number 4. What impact do you think this document had on the debate described in the opening paragraph? In the end, do you think the Spanish would be more likely to side with Bartolomeo de las Casas or Juan Inés de Sepúlveda? And I thought the class did a really interesting job in discussing this. I saw a lot of answers very early on saying that they thought that Bartolomeo de las Casas were really influential and that they thought that would be kind of the prevailing argument. But when some students started pointing out that, well, as convincing as they sound to us today, they might not have been as convincing to the people back in Spain who are living in a very different culture and in very different cultural values than we do today. And I think a lot of people realized, oh, that might be a good point, and that perhaps those in Spain would be going more with, what would be more profitable for them, not necessarily what would be, kind of the more kind of morally correct viewpoint to take. To a certain degree, I think both sides are kind of correct. Ultimately, Bartolomeo de las Casas' argument did reach some people's ears, and it did have a certain degree of impact. One really good example of this is King Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, which Spain was technically a part of at this point in time, is ultimately swayed by arguments such as this by Bartolomeo de las Casas, and actually orders the encomienda system to come to an end. He orders the conquistadors to free the American Indians who are living underneath them and stop enslaving and abusing them. This kind of runs into the second point of this question, or the second side of this, I should say, in which case it seems like more Spanish were more than willing to side with Juan Inés de Sepúlveda because it was just more profitable for them to do so. It became much more in their best interest, they thought, to view American Indians as barbaric or as uncivilized and give themselves the quote-unquote right to enslave them because they were making a lot of money off it. They were getting labor essentially for free, and it was empowering them. And essentially the response back to Charles V from the conquistadors in the New World was to go screw yourself, to not put too fine a point on it. We're over here, you're over there, and there's nothing you can do to kind of change this. So even though this argument did reach some ears in Spain, it simply did not have enough weight behind it to change the beliefs of the people who were actually in the New World and the practice that they were setting up to pretty much enrich themselves. So kind of a both sides kind of scenario to that. All right, that's all I have for this week. Thank you all very much for your great time, effort, and participation, and I hope this week is going just as well.